if you will, go ahead and turn your Bibles now to Proverbs chapter 25. We're going to begin. Actually, we're going to read verse 1 and then tie it together with our beginning in verse 2 of Proverbs 25. Verse 1 said, "These also are the proverbs of Solomon, which the men of Hezekiah, king of Judah, copied." I'd ask you a question. Why do you suppose Hezekiah, 100 years after Solomon, is so interested in what Solomon is writing? What role did Solomon have in God's kingdom? He was a king. What other role did he have? What's that? Built a temple. He was a prophet. You know how I know he's a prophet? He wrote scripture. God inspired him to do that. And so when you read the writings here of Solomon, you're reading God's message to his son, Rehoboam, who's going to be a king. But 100 years later, the men of Hezekiah are saying, these are some messages, these are some principles which we need, and the ones we have collected here are relating to the righteous rule of a king. So let's begin. We're going to read verses 2 through 7, and then we'll come back and try to see if there's some lessons to be learned here. "It is the glory of God to conceal a matter, but the glory of kings to search out a matter. As the heavens for height and the earth for depth, so the heart of the king is unsearchable. Take away the dross from silver, and it will go to the silversmith for jewelry. Take away the wicked from before the king, and his throne will be established in righteousness. Do not exalt yourself in the presence of the king, and do not stand in the place of the great. For it is better that he should say to you, 'Come up here,' than that you should be put lower in the presence of the prince whom your eyes have seen." Well, let's go back to verse 2 for just a moment here. It's the glory of God to conceal a matter. Now, the glory of kings is to search. What's the difference between God and a king? How much does God know? He knows everything. Does God need to search out anything? No, he doesn't. He already knows it all. And so it's his glory to do what? To conceal. You know, God at times chooses to reveal, but there are times he chooses to conceal something. For instance, when you read the parables in Matthew 13, what did Jesus say that the parables were written for? Our understanding. But he said, having eyes to see and ears to hear. They don't see, because God has chosen to not allow these people who are not choosing to do right to be able to perceive what he's talking about. They had a dual purpose in mind. Well, it's the glory of God that he can conceal something. On the other hand, it is the glory of kings to search out a matter. Now, if you look at a king, what is the most important role that he would have in trying to do what's right? Okay, maintain law and order, but how do you know what's right and what's wrong? How do you know who's right and who's wrong? God already knows that. You got to be wise and make the best decision. Is he not hitting out here or hinting at the king being a person who doesn't think he knows it all, but is willing to search and try to find what is right versus what is wrong? Would you appreciate it if our elected leaders would say, let me take the Bible out and see how I'm supposed to rule here. And then to say, okay, I go over here and I read, this is what God says a man ought to do. Okay, that's what I'm going to do. That is the glory of kings, to search out a matter. But it's also to search out for a person who would be right versus one who would be wrong. Have you ever seen a person that you thought was guilty and then later find out they weren't guilty? I've mentioned the other day that since some of my shows that I've been watching have gone away, I've watched a lot more of these whodunit kind of shows. And it appears that maybe there's a homicide taking place, and you think you know immediately who it is. Guess what they do? They string you along for probably about 20 minutes, and you feel like, hey, yeah, they're guilty, they're guilty. And then you find out they're not guilty, somebody else is. Our problem is that many times we don't search things out well enough to make sure we know what is right. Now look at verse 3. As the heavens for height and the earth for depth, so the heart of the king is unsearchable. You got the extremes, heaven and earth, for height and depth, but it says his heart is unsearchable. What does he mean by that? What if you were the wise advisor to Hezekiah and you can say, okay, here's what Solomon wrote. I want to know what that means. You wouldn't last very long as his advisors. The heart of the king is unsearchable. He is in a higher position than you are. You're not in the position to go and say to him, why did you do this? Why did you do that? The king may search you out, but can you search him out? Now, we live in our country today. What do we think about our rulers? We tend to think we are in the position of being able to hold them account. But even in our elected democracy, I was in a grocery store yesterday and a fellow came walking by me and I thought he was talking to himself, but evidently he was talking to me. And he was railing about a current issue. And I told him, I said, I can't do one thing about it one way or the other. And I can't. You know, I am really glad, as Paul said in Philippians, our citizenship is in heaven. And you know, if you look at some of these other countries, you may feel for those people. You may wish that this was one way or the other. But in reality, you can say that really doesn't affect me because that's not my citizenship. A lot of this gets under our skin because we look at ourselves too much as citizens here rather than citizens of heaven. It's liberating to not allow yourself to be so attached to this world. But if you lived in Russia, do you think you could go up to Vladimir Putin and say to him, why are you doing what you're doing? You'd disappear. You know, most countries you do that. The heart of the king is unsearchable. People are not able to, but now there's somebody who can search the hearts of kings. God can. There's a lot of indicated behind the scenes in this humility on the part of the ruler. Now, let's look at verses 4 and 5. Take away the dross from silver, and it will go to the silversmith for jewelry. What do you mean by that? Take away the dross. What is a dross? Impurities. Whether it's gold or silver, they generally will melt it down. And what takes place is the pure metal separates from all of the other parts of it, and then they will generally take and brush off the dross, the dirt, if you will, from the pure metal. And he says, so you take away the dross from silver, and now it's ready for the silversmith. He can make some jewelry out of it. Verse 5, take away the wicked from before the king, and his throne will be established in righteousness. What's the message to Hezekiah among all these other kings. Out of your counsel, but even out of your kingdom. You look at what he said here about God's glory is to conceal a matter. It's the glory of kings to search out a matter. Now, if I am a good king, what am I going to do about those people who are in my kingdom that are wicked? Get rid of them. Is there a basis or principle in Scripture for society ejecting, banishing, or imprisoning those people who are going to be wicked? Yes. We sometimes want to think that, we can live among wickedness, and that's not what he is suggesting here at all. Now, verses 6 and 7, I think is valuable. Do not exalt yourself in the presence of the king, and do not stand in the place of the great. For it is better that he should say to you, come up here, than you should be put in the presence of the prince whom your eyes have seen. Now, what does it mean, do not exalt yourself? That is true. Sometimes you may go to a place and you think, okay, well, I can just sit anywhere I want to sit. And then you look, there's cards there, but it's blank on this side. You walk around the other side and it said VIP. And you say, I shouldn't be sitting here. This is not my place. Have you ever been asked to move by somebody at a place? I have been. And it's embarrassing. It's embarrassing because somebody says, well, did you really think you were that high up on the totem pole? Even though you didn't have any intent of doing anything, it's embarrassing to do that. But when a person exalts themselves in the presence of the king, they feel like, hey, we're on an even plane here. I can talk to you just like you can talk to me. What happens pretty soon? You're shown your place. You realize, I don't stand on the even plane with the king. He says, do not stand in the place of the great. Don't go in before the king and act like that you have the ability, you have the power, you have the presence to say, you've got to do what I tell you to do. You'll find out real quickly that you don't. And then in verse 7, better to say, come up here. Again, as Joe alluded, you can write in the margin of your Bible, Luke 14, verses 8 through 10, where Jesus used that same point. Let me give you some parallel passages which I think are valuable. In Proverbs 25 and verse 27, he said, it is not good to eat much honey. So to seek one's own glory is not glory. To seek your own glory is not glory. Chapter 27 and verse 2 says, let another man praise you, not your own mouth, a stranger, and not your own lips. Have you ever met somebody who could just spend all the time telling you how great they were? There's some folks that by the time I sit there listening to them for about 5 minutes, I'm thinking, whew, you're making me tired. Chapter 16 and verse 19. Better to be of a humble spirit with the lowly than to divide the spoil with the proud. It's better to be a humble person and to allow yourself to be exalted by somebody else rather than you yourself trying to exalt yourself. I think there's two principles found in these verses. Number one, the need to respect the position of God above everyone else, including kings. Number two, to be humble before authority, including kings. If you're humble, it goes a whole lot further than being proud and demanding. I don't know if I ought to mention this, but it's not before kings, but have you ever been somewhere to a restaurant or to a business and someone comes in and they're going to lecture the person there on they shouldn't do this, they shouldn't do this, or they ought to do things differently? And I think, well, it's that person's business. If you don't want to shop here, you don't have to shop here. But are you going to tell them how to run their own business and what they ought to do? Well, I think that indicates you don't have an appreciation for someone else's role, and I think that's part of what's involved here. Sure, absolutely. Okay, let's go to verses 8 through 10 now. Real interesting section here. Do not go hastily to court, for what will you do in the end when your neighbor has put you to shame? Debate your case with your neighbor, and do not disclose your secret or the secret to another, lest he who hears it expose your shame and your reputation be ruined. Now, let's begin with this first idea of hastily. What is to do something hasty? Yeah, you didn't think about what you were doing, you just did it. How many of you have ever been hasty in something? All of us. The Bible is pretty clear about how a person should react in doing things hastily or not. In chapter 20 and verse 21, he said, an inheritance gained hastily at the beginning will not be blessed at the end. How does a person get an inheritance hastily? Well, I think about the prodigal son. You remember the prodigal son, what he did? He said, Father, give me that portion of the inheritance which comes to me. If most of us received our inheritance when we were young, what would we have done with it? I knew this family. The husband and wife did not have any children, so they were going to leave all of their estate to their nieces and nephews. When the nieces and nephews got there, they all went out and bought matching Continental town cars. Now, if you knew the older couple, and by the way, some of you probably do know who they are, but those people saved and scrimped and did without so they could have plenty saved up. But some people are immature when they get something quickly, hastily. It's usually not very well blessed. Chapter 21 and verse 5. The plans of the diligent lead surely to plenty, but those of everyone who is hasty surely to poverty. You try to get too rich too quick, guess what happens? You lose it fast. People sometimes want to do that. And then there's one more, chapter 29 and verse 20 says, do you see a man hasty in his words? There's more hope for a fool than for him. Somebody who speaks before he thinks. Hasty is to do something before you have thought it through. Well, now you see, do not go hastily to court. What would be going to court hastily? If you're wrong would be definitely going hasty. But you may not know all of the elements that are a part of that. Let me just for a moment here give you a little bit of background. He who believes something without investigation. You may have misunderstood the situation. You may have misunderstood those who are involved. And now I want to tie it back to what he's just talked about. It's the glory of a king to do what? Search out a matter. Does a king want to bring a man in, and in this case, let's call it the government? Would you want a policeman to say, okay, I saw somebody driving a red truck wearing a suit, and that person committed a crime over on the east side of town. And then me go get in my little truck wearing a suit, and somebody said, that's got to be him. I said, no, it couldn't be me. I was teaching the class on the northwest side of town. Oh, but you're driving a red truck. And you're wearing a suit. It's got to be you. What is that? Being too hasty. Because there might be more than one red truck. And on Sunday, there might be more than one person wearing a suit. So you don't make decisions without proper investigation, without searching it out. And so he says, for what will you do in the end when your neighbor has put you to shame? Well, it's possible that you may go and you find out you're wrong. Do you suppose there's ever been a dispute of property lines between neighbors? And maybe when you bought the piece of property, the person you bought it from said, now I know where the line's at, the line's here. And then the guy over here buys a piece of property and he thinks, his previous owner told him, said the line's over there. And so, okay, I'm going to carry you to court. And then the judge says, okay, we got to have a surveyor to come out and survey. And guess what? It's not where either one of you thought it was. You see, it's easy for a person to go to court without doing their proper investigation. What should they have done? Searched it out to start with. Find out what's the truth. Well, let me give you a biblical principle there. Let's go to Matthew 18, verses 15 through 17. You're familiar with this, but I think you'll get the point here. He says, moreover, if your brother sins against you, go and show him his fault or tell him his fault between you and him alone. If he hears you, you have gained your brother. Why is it valuable to do that between you and him alone? Avoid going to court. Number one, you may find out information you didn't know. Number two, you may find out you were in the wrong. Number three, you may be able to solve it before you go to court and nobody else ever know how big of a fool you were. You see, there's so much involved in this. When your neighbor has put you to shame, there's been a lot of people who went to court and found out afterwards that they were the ones who had made the mistake. Mm-hmm. Absolutely. Yeah, I mean, here he says, debate your case with your friend, your family, somebody else. What does he say? Debate your case with your neighbor. Do not disclose the secret to another. Well, I don't know how you can put it any plainer than that. Is make sure that you try to go that person first. But look at verse 10. Lest he who hears it expose your same and your reputation be ruined. If I go off half-cocked, which is sort of the phrase, and I am willing to accuse someone else without knowing the facts, when it all comes out in the end, whose reputation is going to be destroyed? Your own reputation. So a person ought to, as he says here, don't go hastily. Now, that applies to Facebook. Just because you read what somebody said doesn't mean that you have to immediately say, aha, I'm fixing to straighten them out, because you may not know what you're talking about. You may not understand all the things that are involved. You may not have read what they wrote correctly. So my suggestion is you step back and think before you speak. Don't do anything hastily, because if you do, you know what's going to happen to your reputation? People are going to say, he's just a crackpot anyway. All right, let's go to verses 11 and 12. A word fitly spoken is like apples of gold in settings of silver. Like an earring of gold and an ornament of fine gold is a wise rebuker to an obedient ear. Now, it's just amazing as you read Solomon's writings. He talked about earlier, you take away the dross from silver, and what happens to it? It's pure, but what do you do with it then? You make jewelry out of it. You take it to the jeweler. He's going to make a piece of jewelry out of it. Solomon is keeping that theme in mind. A word fitly spoken is like apples of gold in settings of silver. Is it pretty to see a piece of jewelry made out of two precious metals together? Gold and silver, how that silver whitish look contrast well with the gold look or the yellowish look of gold, and you see the beauty of them together. He says, a word fitly spoken. What does that word fitly mean? Timely? Correctly? Well thought. Okay. That's certainly, you put all these ideas together. A person thinks, what am I going to say? How am I going to say it? When am I going to say it? And are there some people who appear to have the talent of having the right words to say at the right time? Yeah, they are. You know, years and years ago, there was a book written by a brother named Cleon Lyles. The title of that book is, I Wish I Had Said That. And his mind was, you know, I'm always a little, about a day afterwards, and somebody says something, I think, boy, that was really perceptive. That was really wise. That person knew exactly what to say at the right time. You know why people are able to do that? They listen first, they think about what they're going to say, and when the situation arises, they know what to say. A word fitly spoken. Now put that with the context that just preceded about going hastily to court. Is it possible that we ought to think about what we're going to say, how we're saying it, when we're going to say it, in order to accomplish the greatest good? I think so. Then he describes, he says, like an earring of gold and an ornament of fine gold is a wise rebuker to an obedient ear. What's the difference between a wise rebuker and an unwise rebuker? Okay. Somebody who's rebuking someone and knows he's saying the right thing. What else would be a wise rebuker? Okay, he's communicated it in a way that's not offensive, that the person will listen to it. Is timing very important? Let me ask you men. You and your wife are having a disagreement, and you say something right away. How well does that work out for you? As Alan said, never, lead balloon. Is there a time to say something later? And carefully think about the way that you're going to say it. Or say nothing at all. But in this case, it's a word fitly spoken. It's been thought through and it's been presented in a right way. He said, it's like an earring of gold and ornament of fine gold is a wise rebuker. What the person is saying on this side to an obedient ear, to a person listening on this side. Is it just as important how I listen as how I speak? Yes. Boy, isn't it amazing how much wisdom Solomon has in just a few words? How that, I can see Hezekiah's men say, boy, that's a good one. That's got to go right up there near the front. Well, I'm sorry. I speak a little more than 5 minutes. You have to realize that Solomon here is talking about what a person is saying, how they're saying it, but also the ability of a person to listen and say, is he telling me the truth? Do I really need to do this? And if a person is saying the right thing the right way with the right time, and here I am, is it good for me to say, well, maybe I need to listen here? Other people tried to tell me the same thing. Now, it's something for me to listen and to learn. And he missed every bit of this. Let me offer some parallel passages here before I run out of time. In chapter 18 and verse 21, death and life are in the power of the tongue. Chapter 15 and verse 23, he said, a man has joy by the answer of his mouth, and a word spoken in due season, how good it is. But my favorite is Isaiah chapter 50 and verse 4. The Lord has given me the tongue of the learned, that I should know how to speak. A word in season to him who is weary. He awakens me morning by morning. He awakens my ear to hear as the learned. Wow. I want to have the tongue of the learned, and I want to have the ear of the learned. One passage got so much in it. And I would point out, too, that if you look at verse 12 here, like an earring of gold and an ornament of fine gold, there's some people who their words make them look good just like good jewelry does. You see a lady who comes up and she's got a beautiful brooch on and she's got beautiful earrings in and she may have beautiful rings on her hand, and you say, well, that's pretty. There are some people who their voice, like the worthy woman in Proverbs 31, the law of kindness is on her tongue. She's a good woman who speaks in that way. Well, in the same vein, let's look at verses 13 through 15. Like the cold of snow in the time of harvest is a faithful messenger to those who send him. For he refreshes the soul of his masters. Whoever falsely boasts of giving is like clouds without and wind without rain. By long forbearance a ruler is persuaded, and a gentle tongue breaks the bones. Now, let's notice what he says here in verse 13. Cold snow in the time of harvest. What's the hottest time of the year? Harvest time is. Brother Leonard used to grow peas, and he'd call me and say, Tony, the peas are ready. You know when that is? When it's so hot during the daytime that you can't, if you walk outside, you sweat just thinking hard. So I try to get up and go early in the morning so while it's still cool. But he talks about here the cold of the snow in the time of harvest. I've got some friends who live in Colorado, and they put pictures on of Thursday. I think it was like 88 there. And then they put pictures of Saturday morning, and it would look like 2 or 3 inches of snow. I know Ray wouldn't, but how many of you would like a good, cool breeze to blow through after the past few days? Now, I know Ray wouldn't. He loves the heat, but most of us would like a refreshing, cool breeze to come through. That's the picture he's trying to give here. Notice it says it refreshes the soul of his masters. He gets up and he feels, oh boy, it's a beautiful day outside. Wonderful. Great day. He said that's the way a faithful messenger is to those who send him. You send somebody and he does what you ask him to do. He says what you authorized and told him to say. He's your messenger. Here's a person who's refreshing, but in contrast to that, look at verse 14. Whoever falsely boasts of giving, like clouds and wind without rain. Now, that figure is used in the New Testament. In the book of Jude, in verse 12, he said, these are spots in your love feast. While they feast with you without fear, serving only themselves, they are clouds without water, carried about by winds, late autumn trees without fruit, twice dead, pulled up by the roots. He said, you know, you look out there and let's say you're a farmer like David. He's saying, okay, we need some rain. And you see a big cloud appear in the sky and the wind starts blowing. You say, boy, it's going to come a good rain. Next thing you know, what happens to the cloud? It just disappears. You're like, whew, we missed that one. Well, he's saying that a person who boasts falsely of giving is like that. Have you ever met somebody who would tell you how much they were going to do, how much work they had done in the past, what they were going to accomplish, and then how much do they usually do? Very little. I wish I had all of your sayings. That's true. I mean, I hear the clucking but see no eggs, if y'all didn't hear that. But that's, I mean, same principle that's found in this is there's sometimes people who talk but they don't do anything. And Titus chapter, I believe it's 1 verse 16 says, they profess to know God, but by their works they deny him. You know, they say they're faithful to God and they're not really doing anything. So the picture here is the contrast between those. And then verse 15, the application. By long forbearance, a ruler is persuaded, and a gentle tongue breaks a bone. What's his point here in verse 15? Persistence, patience, calmness. What's more important? You telling everybody what you're going to do, you're being a blowhard, you're trying to exalt yourself in front of the king, or a man who comes up and who quietly, patiently has thought through everything he's going to say, and now he has said it in a gentle kind of way. What does that actually do? We talked about here just in a couple verses before about a person who was a wise rebuker to an obedient ear. Let me ask you a question. The way we approach people with the gospel, does that have any impact on the way they will receive it? Sometimes we may come off with leaving the impression is, I'm smart and you're dumb. But you can correct somebody, though, and they'll appreciate you for it. But a lot of it depends on how you do that, doesn't it? How many of you had a really wise grandparent who could take you to the woodshed, so to speak, and you thank them for it? Because you knew they loved you, you knew they cared about you, and they were trying to help you, not trying to hurt you. And they didn't embarrass you publicly. They told you out where it's just between you and them alone. Is there a way, now I've spent all this time talking about, from verses 1 through 15, about how the king of Hezekiah's men copied these things out. And by long forbearance, a ruler is persuaded. I'd suggest to you there's two aspects to this. Number one, there is the side of the king. I need to be listening to this person. I need to listen to the way they're talking to me. I need to listen to what they're trying to communicate. But on the other side, this person who's out here speaking, is there a way that we can persuade our government to do things one way versus another? Is there a way that we as Christians can express ourselves like on the abortion debate? We all know what the Bible teaches about life. It begins at conception. But is there a way that we can do it in a way that we teach people? Do we let a woman who has made a serious mistake, who's sinned grievously, to tell her, we love you, we're concerned about you, yes, you made a mistake, but there's a right way to fix it versus a wrong way? I like the approach that says adoption instead of abortion. To say, here's a good alternative. Here's an alternative where your child that you brought into this world, you may not feel that you want this child. You may not feel, but there's a couple over here that can't have children that would love to have a child. And you could provide them with joy and happiness, and you could provide that child with a life. Does that sound a lot better than the harsh rhetoric that sometimes we use with people? Now, that doesn't mean that I don't think it's wrong. But using a wise tongue, I think what Solomon has been trying to drive home here is that, folks, you can approach things differently. And I think the same thing is true when we're trying to teach somebody the gospel, is that we've got to approach them not with, I'm smart, you're dumb, exalting ourselves, that's in that context there. Not with approaching people with, let me tell you where all you've messed up and where all I've done right. And then you become like the Pharisee and the tax collector. But that you approach a person, here's something I found. I want you to be able to enjoy it and have the ability to enjoy the fruits of it as well. Anybody have any questions? Comments? Okay, Lord willing, next week we're going to pick up with verse 16, and we're going to talk about too much of a good thing.